Hello everyone, welcome to video 2. In the last video we looked at the concept of goods and services circulation and that we need to have money in circulation that keeps these two things in balance. At the end of the video we looked at some graphs showing how the Australian economy behaves and the especially important role the government budget balance plays in that behaviour. We talked about how, since about 2012, the government has been decreasing deficits and this is starting to stifle the Australian economy. In this video, we look at an example of how, if there had been a government who acknowledges modern monetary economics, they might have run the economy and what that would have meant for the other economic variables we looked at. We'll also expand on why it's possible for it to do things differently. So, to start off, a quick refresher with the graphs from the last video. We saw that after 2012, we ran decreased deficits and that this was causing private savings to drop, private debt to rise, and growth was just starting to drop. For this video, we're going to add another graph to our collection of 5 from the last video. It's an inflation graph. To fit all 6, I've split them into 2 columns of 3. Inflation is bottom right. I'm going to prune off all the years prior to 1998 so we can see more carefully what's going on. I would have liked to have pruned off more, but we need to go back that far so we can see some years of higher growth and higher inflation to contrast against the last decade. You can see that around the period 2010 to 2014, things were relatively stable in the economy. Private saving was constant and private debt levels were neither increasing or decreasing. Around this time, the deficit was varying, but if we look at an average, it's not unrealistic to say it was sitting around about 3% of GDP at the time. Based on the logic of modern monetary economics, the position of government should be to run whatever deficit, which is a money injection, remember, that keeps the money in circulation in balance with productive capacity. So since we could see that things were stable at a deficit of around 3% of GDP, that's a good starting point for what they should have done. So we'll mock up our graphs to have a bit of a look at what we would have expected as a result. I'm going to assume a constant current account just to make things easy. We'll set it about where it averaged from 2012 to 2019 at a deficit of around 3%. You can see the graphs now showing this. The current account is nice and constant, and I've added in black bars on the budget balance graph to show how much extra deficit our modern monetary government would have run. I would have expected the private savings and private debt to hold steady like they were in the part where the government did already run 3%-ish budget deficits. The last 2 graphs will be the interesting ones. As a result of the increased deficits, we should expect inflation to have held up higher. I've marked it at about 3.7% with the black bars to show the increase over what it was in reality. Similarly, I've kept growth up where it averaged around 2010 to 2014 of just over 3%, and I've used the black bars to show the increase over what happened with the decreasing deficits. That extra growth might not look like much, but it should have decreased unemployment substantially and kept underemployment from increasing. We also have to consider what might have been done with the extra deficit injection. In round terms, that extra injection of money into the economy since 2012 is about $100 billion, which is a significant amount. This could have made a substantial difference in several areas that we might wish to improve, such as health, education, infrastructure, and fighting climate change. Okay, so this has been a bit of a heavy patch. Let's lighten it up a little and go back to some simple diagrams and go over some nuance of how and why governments can deficit spend like this. I like to use a footprint analogy to help understand where spending is at and where it could go. The largest spending footprint of all is one that would use up every bit of available capacity in the economy. I call this the maximum capacity footprint. This is a limit we will not get to for reasons I'll explain later. However, we should aim to get fairly close to it. Inside this footprint, I'll mark the size of the private sector spending footprint. It takes up nearly 3/4 of our maximum capacity footprint. Next, I'll add in the public sector or government spending footprint. In Australia, currently, this takes up about 1/4 of the maximum capacity footprint. The next part is the one we'll focus on most for the next few minutes. Currently in Australia, there is capacity not being used, and if we chose, we could use that up. The extra spending it would take to do this brings us to what I call the maximum spending footprint. How do I know this extra spending can be done though? Well, let's look at that. On the next slide, we see a stylized graph of capacity utilisation versus inflation. We can see that there are 2 main parts to the graph. The first is a relatively flat section of line, and in this zone there are only small changes in price inflation for even large increases in the amount of production capacity being sold. You also note that below some level, 70% in the example here, the inflation is below zero. That is, prices will decrease. As production utilisation in the sector increases and gets up to high levels, the relationship changes and the line increases steeply. In this zone, small increases in capacity utilisation will bring relatively large changes in inflation. Note that it is possible to go beyond 100%, so I've marked a 100% line a bit in from the end on this next graph. Inflation will be high at this point, but does drop if production capacity is expanded. In fact, on that note, we can recognise that in economies which have generally grown, there would have been a time in the past when production capacity was lower. Therefore, the steep part of our curve would have been shifted over to the left, as shown currently on the graphic. For our purposes though, we're going to consider the production capacity to be constant. In this next graphic, I've marked a hypothetical current spending level with a green line. This is the sum of where the private sector and public sector spending combined together are at. It is at around 94% of the production capacity level. We can see that at this level of spending on this sector's production, inflation runs at about 2%. Let's say our government was comfortable with inflation at 5% though. I'll draw a line down in red from the 5% level to the spending axis to see at what level of spending this level of inflation would occur, and from our diagram we can see that this is 98%. This is the unutilised capacity in the economy that I was talking about before, the red zone in this graphic, and the government can always create new money to fill this gap. Let me emphasise, this utilisation gap can be used up and is bought with new money. It needs no tax-based funding. In fact, an attempt at tax-based funding will be difficult because, in essence, all we will be doing is causing the current level, the green bar, to drop down. That is, to move to the left by our increased taxes. And then when we spent the taxes, it would just put it back up to where it was. You could do it by taxing other sectors more and then bringing the spending power across to boost this one up. But then you've just made the green lines in those other sectors drop down. So now the government has more spending power in those. It is unwise to try and chase all the way to 100% capacity use because that carries great risk of pushing the economy into a region where inflation will be so high that it becomes destabilising. So remember, the government's job is to do its spending such that it uses up the productive capacity, not every last piece of productive capacity, but enough such that using up most of it, but not so much as to cause inflation above its target levels. The government needs to make the injections of money for this, and said in the unfortunate conventional terminology, that means it needs to have deficits for it. At different points in the economic cycle, the amount of unutilised capacity can be higher or lower. Here is an example where the private sector and public sector spending footprint is higher than previous, and so our unutilised capacity is lesser. This would be at the peak of a boom, for instance. At other times, like the start of a bust, there will be more capacity unused, and the government can use this up with newly created money. Let's expand this concept a little, as we've really only considered an economy as a whole. Let's do an example with a few different sectors and apply our understanding there. So in this graphic, I've taken our 5-sector economy footprint and lined it up against our simple whole economy footprint. Note that the 5-sector economy footprint matches up in size with the maximum spending footprint, not the maximum capacity footprint, which is the slightly larger one, which we don't want to go into because it's going to cause us inflation problems. So I've put on some typical figures from the Australian economy. The private sector spending footprint is about $900 billion a year. The public sector is about $300 billion for a GDP total of around $1,200 billion. From our earlier part of the video where we were targeting a deficit of about 3% of GDP, that equates to about $36 billion, but I'm just going to use 30 for a nice round figure. Note then, if we presented the diagram to scale, that it would be hard to see the 30 billion section. So I'm going to make it not to scale and keep our unutilised part the same size so we can see what's going on more clearly. Now, thus far in our example, we've had a nice simple world where we didn't have to think about uneven, unutilised capacity. But what happens in reality is that different sectors are at different utilisations, and this changes from year to year. So if we consider the sector columns as like columns in a column graph, I'm going to put in green lines to show where the spending is at relative to the maximum spending footprint of each of the individual sectors. We can see that the labour sector is the least utilised and looks to be at only about 75 to 80% of its maximum spending footprint, whereas construction is right up there at over 90%. So let's say our government is looking at spending our 30 billion that we spoke about before, Well, it can do this wisely or dumbly. Let's look at the dumb example first. In this example, we simply take our spending and split it up evenly and then spend it into the sectors. I've shown this on the diagram by the red boxes. They have $6 billion each. We can see that some sectors finish up outside their maximum spending footprint, while the labour sector is still well short. Those sectors which are outside will stretch and cause inflation in the economy and damage it a bit. Let's have a look at how we should do things smartly. Now we've nicely distributed our 30 billion to fill up each sector to its maximum spending footprint size. So the spending and the spending, where it goes matters as much as how much is spent. Just a few more minor things to cover. I just want to show you another variation of this gap utilisation concept. Have a look at the following graphic. It is a bunch of columns indicating the size of an economy over 5 years. We can see that each year the economy grows larger than previous. These columns look like they're probably 20% larger each year, and in reality it's much smaller, like 2 or 3%, but I've exaggerated it for ease of viewing purposes. As the economy grows, spending has to be done to use up the expanded productive capacity. This has to be done mostly with newly created money. Not all of it is done with newly created money, as some amount can be done with bank created money too. The last thing I want to do is just go over another visualization of the gap filling concept. This time we'll do it with a recirculating flow graphic. So you can see our donut shape there and the arrows indicating the flow moving around. So an amount of goods that flow around are bought by private sector spending, and we can indicate this with the same blue colour as earlier. Then there is an amount bought by the public sector, enabled by taxation, that's in green. Then there is the gap filling we can do if we are below our inflation target. That's indicated by red. And finally there's a small amount of production capacity that it is unwise to use up because it'll just cause too much inflation. That's the white part, and I've taken the circulation arrows off that part in the last graphic because that production capacity wouldn't be getting utilised. So with all the information you've been given in these videos by now, you should know that the government can spend even without taking tax. The main reasons for this are to correct for drains of money out of circulation, to fill up unused capacity due to the vagaries of the business cycle, and to use up gaps induced by growing production capacity. Tax is of course very important, so I'm definitely not advocating that we don't tax. I'm just saying that it's important for everyone to realise that this is not the only way a government can spend. Okay, recap time. As stated in video 1 and in this video, it's important that government balance spending to productive capacity. At first glance, that seems easy, but it's a bit trickier than one would imagine, considering the relationship between inflation and productive capacity utilisation and the fact that each sector in the economy will have its own unique setting. What isn't unique is that at the moment in the Australian economy, there is almost always some gap that will be present between the current spending footprint and the footprint we'd occupy if we were targeting some higher level of inflation. This gap will need to be filled with newly created money, and the smart government does this by being careful about what it spends and where. One of the next things we will look at is an even more detailed study into spending in the labour sector and why we can have a job guarantee. Also, we've talked a bit about inflation, but I want to do a video giving some more explanation on how we could manage inflation given its importance in modern monetary economics. Also, modern monetary economics doesn't view productivity and productive capacity in quite the same way as what mainstream economics does. Instead, it has a very all-encompassing, holistic view on it, and I think that's another important thing for people to understand. So, thank you for listening, and I hope this video has explained how government spending capacity is a little bit bigger and more diverse than people currently appreciate, and that while we are running the economy like it's a household budget, we are missing opportunities to do things better, solve some of our problems, and give everyone a good quality of life, and that's something we should all want to fix.